There's nothing better to show love for Mac than to have a table full of them. All of these are the M1 Macintosh system in different form factors. These are the one that Apple sells currently, and I have been running a lot of testing and benchmarking on them for the photography app. Primarily, I'm focusing on Lightroom Classic and Lightroom, the cloud version, and there are some interesting revelations that I found out. So I'm going to revise a little bit some of my recommendation that I made earlier saying that the M1 Mac is not fully ready for pro workflow. I still think that there are some bottlenecks here and there, but if you want to embrace the Apple Silicon and you want to get into it right now without waiting for the pro machine, there is a pathway, and I will share with you the best Mac that you should get for a pro photography workflow and also the minimum specification that you should look for. Let's find out. This is ArtIsRight. Before we start, subscribe if you're new and hit on the bell icon so you'll be notified every time I upload cool new videos like this. So this is a look at some preliminary testing result. This is not a review of the 24-inch iMac in any way at all. However, there are some insight comparing the 24-inch iMac with the Mac Mini, and you're going to find that out when we talk about these benchmark that I've done. So let's have a look at Lightroom Classic and Lightroom, the cloud version. And from my perspective, I am a weddings and events photographer. I also do architecture. So I'm dealing with thousands and thousands of images, either that or I'm stitching Panorama, merging HDR, and I need everything to function properly pretty much on day one. And when I've done my videos comparing all these features before, if you have followed my channel, you will know that I say, well, the M1 is not really quite there yet, right? So the M1 processor hasn't really changed, but there are a few variables that have changed in the interim between that video and now. Number one, Apple have updated macOS Big Sur to a newer version, and every time they update it, they tend to do a lot of bug fix, making the software run more efficiently. Secondly, Adobe has also released an updated version for Lightroom. So right now, Lightroom Classic is 10.2. Granted, it's not fully M1 yet. It doesn't run natively on the computer. It just runs on Rosetta 2, but it works really great now, amazingly enough. And you're going to see some of the performance numbers that will pretty much, I think, surprise you in some way compared to the test that I've done earlier a few months back. Also, Lightroom, the cloud version, is now fully running on the M1 processor native as an Apple application, so it's no longer running on Rosetta 2, but certain functions of that program is still fairly limited. And I'll share with you when we get to that point what are some of the limitations that I found out. All right, so let's briefly talk about the test system that I have. So I have these 5 test systems. So I have my trusty Mac Pro that I have been using for, I would probably say, like about the past year or so. It is a 12-core, 3.3 gigahertz Xenon, 96 gigabytes of memory. It's just crazy amount of stuff. Radeon Pro Vega 2, 32 gigabytes of high bandwidth memory, 2 terabyte SSD. I also have my 2019 16-inch MacBook Pro, which is an 8-core, 2.4 gigahertz, 32 gigabytes of memory, and it also has the upgraded video card, the Radeon Pro 5500M. This is not the top one. I think like there's a higher one, like the 5700 M or something like that, but I don't have that one, and it has 2 terabyte SSD. So for the Mac Mini M1, it has the one with the upgraded processor, 8-core, 8 GPU, 16 gigabyte unified memory, 1 terabyte SSD, and you can also see this MacBook Air right here, 8-core, 7 GPU. So this is pretty much a non-upgraded CPU version of it. 8 gigabytes of memory, so again, that has not been upgraded, and 256 gigs of SSD. This is pretty much bare minimum testing machine. Don't need anything more than that. Again, don't recommend getting this though, but we'll talk more about that in just a second. And the latest 24-inch iMac, which is a really impressive machine, by the way. This one has an upgraded processor, 8-core, 8 GPU, 16 gigabyte unified memory, and also 256 gigabyte SSD. Again, test machine, don't need a lot of space on there, so I'm just using the money that I save on the SSD to put into other components such as RAM upgrade. If I was to buy these machines for myself, I would definitely upgrade the SSD to at least 512, but we're also going to talk about that. There's a few things I want to talk about the M1. Number one is the number of display connection that you can have. So on these M1 processors, you can only have 2 display max. What that really means is that if you're on a Mac Mini, you can plug in 2 external displays that will run native on the system. If you are on a M1 with a display, for instance, such as the MacBook Air, MacBook Pro, which by the way, I don't have a MacBook Pro in my lineup here to do the testing, but we can extrapolate some results. So anyway, the MacBook Air, MacBook Pro, and also the 24-inch iMac. All of these computers will only allow you to plug in one more external display to the system, and that's pretty much it. Granted, you can plug in the Apple Retina XDR display onto the system and have it run 6K, it will work, but you're going to be limited to just only one external display. And if you want to plug in a 4K display, it'll work just fine without any issues. But again, you're limited to just one right now. So that is a M1 limit, and I just want you guys to be aware of that. Now let's talk about the calibration. You can hook up a display to it. Can you calibrate them yet? Absolutely, you can. So if you're using ArtIsRight devices that use i1 Profiler software, absolutely, you can go calibrate them now, because i1 Profiler is now running on the M1. Granted, it's still running on Rosetta 2, but it is now compatible with the M1 system. i1 Studio from ArtIsRight is not yet compatible as it is filming. My understanding is that the software should be arriving before the end of May 2021, so fingers crossed, let's hope that comes out. If you're using Spider software to do a software calibration, it currently works with all the M1s right now, at least from my testing, what I have found out, it works. If you run into any issues, I'm not really sure about that, so if you do run into any issues, just leave them in the comments below. And lastly, if you're using BenQ displays and you want to use an SW display with hardware calibration, you can use Palette Master Element software and run a full hardware calibration on any M1 machine, and it will work. And I have tested this out, so that is really great news on the calibration front. So we're going to talk about benchmark, but one of the other things I want to talk about is some of the other limitations or the cap for M1. So starting out, you're going to be limited on the number of ports. The two M1s that have the most number of ports right now is the 24-inch iMac and the Mac Mini, and they have 4 USB ports total. 2 of them are going to be the USB 4 Thunderbolt connection that has pretty much overlay between both, so it will automatically pick between the signal standard it want to use, and the other 2 ports on the system are USB 3.1 Gen 2, which can do 10 gigabits per second, but that's pretty much the only 4 USB ports you have on the system. When you go into the laptop, you're down to just pretty much 2 USB ports. So here's the thing. If you are a pro and you need a lot of ports, you need to plug in a lot of hard drive right now, granted, yes, you can get a USB dock, you can get a separate dock or something like that to run this on, but you're still running into some limitations on the I/O. So if you're any pro like the one that I know and you need a lot of plugs to plug in your peripheral, this may not be the machine for you yet. And holding off is not a bad idea, because a more powerful machine is coming down the road. We know that for sure. So we're going to look at Lightroom Classic and Lightroom Cloud version. So what I've done here is, rather than importing and exporting a few hundred files, I really want to take this machine on endurance, on a real world workflow as I would go through, meaning that I would import thousands of images at a time on multiple Lightroom catalog and as a preview. So here's the thing, I'm not going to do that kind of crazy test, but what I've done here is just set it to import and also export 1000 Nikon D850 45 megapixel RAW files. This is really going to push the machine to the limit in a marathon run, and when we're done with this, we're going to see how the machine is performing, if it does any kind of thermal throttling, meaning that it's slowing down the speed as it heats up. Does the fan kick in? What's really happening here? So this is a really good test to see that. All right, so for my Mac Pro 2019, importing and generating one-to-one previews for these Nikon D850 45 megapixel RAW file took about 13 minutes. The 16-inch MacBook Pro 2019 took about 25 minutes. And in my previous Mac Mini M1 test, this is the one that I ran a few months ago when the machine was, I guess, like pretty much brand new, like only a few weeks old. It took 38 minutes, close to 40 minutes. That's a long time. If you take a look at a graph there, that means you have to wait that much longer for the task to finish. And for me, when you're dealing with thousands of images, having some task that takes, you know, what we're looking at, 13 minutes longer there, it's going to be something that really drags on your workflow. But here's the thing. So I ran the test again with all the updated version for Big Sur and also Lightroom Classic, and pretty much the test come in at 27 minutes. This is now where it's really nudging the 2019 16-inch MacBook Pro. This is getting really interesting now. So it hasn't really nudged out the Mac Pro yet, but obviously, I mean, many of us are not going to go buy the Mac Pro. I mean, granted, that machine costs at the base model, $6,000, the configuration I have costs over $10,000. So it doesn't make sense for all of us to go buy that. So this is going to be a really great machine if you really want to get into it, because it's starting to rival the top-of-the-line Intel performance already. Now, I don't have the 27-inch iMac to test this out, so it's hard for me to really gauge the performance and tell you. My guess is that the 27-inch iMac would still be a touch faster, so that would be my speculation there. And on the 24-inch iMac, this test took about 30 minutes or so, so it's about 3 minutes longer than the Mac Mini. And also on the MacBook Air, this is the one that doesn't have a lot of love from us here, which means I didn't go in and upgrade the components. This one took 42 minutes. Now, a few things I want to say about this is that I don't have the MacBook Pro in the studio to do any type of benchmark testing. But here's the thing. The difference between the Air and the MacBook Pro, the 13-inch model, is that the Air does not have a fan and the MacBook Pro does have a fan. Having a fan is going to be important. So if you're using any type of Pro workflow at all, you want to get the MacBook Pro and just pretty much skip the MacBook Air, because when these machines heat up, there's really no way for it to dissipate the heat quickly. It just has to dissipate through the chassis, which is fine, but it goes through what they call a thermal throttling, meaning that it slows down the processor speed in order for it not to burn up. Now in this test, I also found another interesting thing too between the 24-inch iMac and the Mac Mini that's hiding right here, is that the Mac Mini throughout this entire test runs super silent. It didn't make any sound at all. You can't hear the fan running whatsoever. The 24-inch iMac, kind of disappointing, because the moment I put 10 files into here and it starts generating 10 files, you start hearing the fan running. It sounds almost like a 16-inch MacBook Pro when it's running like it's about to take off. If you have a 16-inch MacBook Pro or a MacBook Pro Intel before, you know how the fan runs. Yeah, that's pretty much the 24-inch iMac that I found out. And consistently in the multiple tests I have ran, the fan always kick on this machine and is rather loud, because it does have two fans on this machine. On the Mac Mini, there's just one on the inside and it has much more room to cool. So just something to think about there. But that's also going to lead me to another conclusion too, which I'll share with you guys in just a moment. All right, so Lightroom Classic, exporting 1000 Nikon D850 file, 45 megapixel. So in my Mac Pro 2019, the previous test, it took around 14 minutes, a little bit over that. Amazingly enough, I ran the test again and it took about 18 minutes. I don't know what happened between now and then that really causes that speed to the speed to slow down and the time to bump up. So I've ran the test multiple times and the number is this higher number. So what I'm probably going to do is create a separate container on the Mac and install a fresh copy of Big Sur and see how that performs with a fresh installation. So we shall see about that. So let's put that on pending for now. The 16-inch MacBook Pro 2019 took about 29 minutes. The Mac Mini M1 in the previous test, this is the one from a few months ago, took close to 40 minutes, but the new test one, again, comes really close to the 16-inch MacBook Pro 2019, and that is 30 minutes. The 24-inch iMac come at about the very same time. It took just slightly longer, but still around the 30-minute mark, and the MacBook Air took around 41 minutes. So the MacBook Air here, not having a processor upgrade doesn't really help, but here's the thing. Number one, this is also an 8GB machine. That is the 8GB RAM instead of 16GB one. So definitely if you're a pro, you need to go to 16GB because it will help out. Secondly, yes, this one has one less GPU core, but Lightroom doesn't really use GPU core for exports. So this is pretty much just using CPU performance. But again, no fan, so the machine does heat up quite a bit and there's no way to quickly dissipate that heat. All right, let's look at Lightroom Classic HDR Merge, and this is merging these 9 Nikon D810 files, 36 megapixel RAW. Let's have a look at the result. So for this test, I pretty much just skipped the MacBook Air because, obviously it's a really slow machine. I'm pretty sure it's going to perform very similarly to how the M1 or how the other M1s are performing. But from now, we can actually take a look at the result. For the Mac Pro, it took 1 minute and around like 9 seconds or so, which took a little bit longer than all the other machines. I was kind of surprised by that for this test. The MacBook Pro did faster. That is 1 minute and 3 seconds. The Mac Mini in the previous test, it took about 1 minute and 10 seconds or so. For the Mac Mini M1, it took about 45 seconds, and I have to extrapolate the data a little bit differently. That's to get the graph to look properly. So it's 0.75 seconds or 0.75 minutes per se. So it's 45 seconds for that. And the 24-inch iMac was just a smidge higher, so it come in at just about 46 seconds or so. So you can see the numbers right there on the graph. So now we have to take a look at this. Doing an HDR merge uses pretty much a single core GPU, so the faster single core performance you have, the better you're off with. But here's the thing, when you're doing a panoramic merge like this with 14 images from, this is Nikon D810 36 megapixel file. This is putting together pretty much like a 314 megapixel images. So let's take a look at the performance. This is where the Mac Pro still shines, and the Intel machine still does a much better job than the M1 machine as of now. So on the Mac Pro, it took about 1 minute and 2 seconds or so. The MacBook Pro took about 1 minute and 17 seconds. On the M1, the previous test, this is also something interesting that I found in, I would say, like an anomaly per se. On the previous test for the M1 Mac Mini, it took 2 minutes and 22 seconds, which was quite some time. But on this new test, it actually took a little bit longer, 2 minutes and 42 seconds. So I did run this test a few times, and that was pretty much a consistent result. So something happened there that slowed it down. While the 24-inch iMac did a little bit better at 2 minutes and 33 seconds. So the M1, pretty much, if you take a look there, that's margin of error. They're pretty much coming up at the same rate or so, so it's not really a big deal. All right, so now let's have a look at Lightroom. So let me be honest with you, I haven't had the time to fully test Lightroom yet, but in the Lightroom cloud version, I've tested exporting the files. The number are very similar to Lightroom Classic, which is the reason why I didn't include it here. But what really bothers me about Lightroom cloud version that runs natively on the M1 machine right now is that when I tried to do a panoramic merge, it took about close to 14 minutes to finish that merge. That similar picture you saw earlier in a few slides ago. That to me does not make any sense at all. So if you're doing a lot of panoramic merge in Lightroom, maybe don't use Lightroom itself, just use Lightroom Classic instead. That's going to probably be better for you. So the cloud version is probably not the way to go, but I'll do some more testing on here and give you some of my thoughts and opinions about that too down the road. And also I haven't tested Capture One because Capture One, again, is not running native on M1. We can see the result for Capture One. I'll put a link to the older video, the past tests up here. You can check out the Capture One result there. It should give you some idea for how Capture One is performing. To simply put, right now, the Radeons are pretty much kicking the M1 butt just because it's pretty much having a lot more processing power to really go through and using the GPU to its full effectiveness, especially the Vega 2 that I have on my Mac Pro. I mean, Capture One just absolutely just love that GPU, but that's also an expensive GPU as well. So until Capture One runs native on M1, we're going to hold off on testing that any further for the time being. With regards to Photoshop, it's now natively on M1, so I don't have a lot to say about Photoshop at the moment. I'm still running out a few more tests and see how that performs. Based on the tests so far running between the beta Apple Silicon version and the Intel running on Rosetta 2 version of Photoshop, there wasn't too big of a difference there between those two in my previous tests. So you can watch my previous video to get some ideas for that. But I'm going to figure out a way how to better revise a Photoshop test and get, get a better test for that. Now, one thing that maybe you've been saying, like, why are you just doing the export? Why aren't you just telling us how it feels? Because let me put it this way. The machine feels pretty much very similar to a 16-inch 2019 MacBook Pro. That is a top-of-the-line MacBook Pro. It's fluid. It moves in about the same way. It doesn't have any more advantage. It doesn't lag any more than that. But here's the thing. For example, if I try to do a lot of editing on my 314 megapixel panorama, the 16-inch MacBook Pro would choke and it would take a while for it to catch up. The M1 pretty much at this point in time does the same thing, and the only machine that can handle that type of large files that I'm working with right now is the Mac Pro and can handle it very smoothly. So if you're working with large files like I am, the Intel one and the top of the spec Intel one are still going to be better to work with those type of files. So now we're starting to delineate the type of work that we do and how you would use this machine. So those are some of my thoughts on these M1 processors. Now, the one thing that I also will say is that the M1 processors right now, they're great. It shows really great performance, and depending on where you are in your creative workflow or your creative career, if you're just looking to get a smaller machine that you can take on the road, the MacBook Pro will work. But yes, again, it doesn't have enough ports right now, so port limitation is going to be a big deal when you're on the road. And I gave a scenario before, for instance, at the end of an event, what we would do with the current 16-inch MacBook Pro right now, because there are 4 ports on there, is that we would download 3 memory cards at the same time, because by the time we're done with the event, we would have like 6 memory cards or 8 memory cards or something. And we want to be able to download all those to the computer quickly, so we can also back it up to another separate SSD so that my staff can edit off-site. Well, let me put it this way. If I have to take a MacBook Pro or even just a MacBook Air on site, that's pretty much going to lengthen the time that I have to do anything, because I only have 2 ports on these machines right now. The desktop one is a little bit better story. You do have 4 ports, but you're still limited. So those are just things to think about. And like I said, the display is being the other limitation. So if you really want to go out and get the M1 right now, if you really want to embrace the Apple Silicon workflow and just want to dive into it right away, the best Mac to get for Pro is the Mac Mini. And the reason why is, as I shared with you earlier, is that when we're doing these hard endurance export, the fan didn't even kick in pretty much at all. I mean, the fan has always been running, but it's super silent. On the 24-inch iMac, you're going to hear the fan running, and I'm sure that that will be the same thing for the MacBook Pro 13-inch one with the M1 processor. So Mac Mini is the best machine right now. You can run 2 external displays, and you can do full calibration on there. And you also have some of the more traditional, like for example, the USB ports on the Mac Mini is a Type A rather than a Type C, so a little bit less dongles. If you want to avoid that, that's also a really good thing too. All right, you want to avoid the MacBook Air if you're a pro, especially if you're using Lightroom or Photoshop, just because, I mean, you saw the performance. It took much longer for it to render, and the price between the MacBook Air and MacBook Pro, it's not that big of a difference. Just go with the MacBook Pro. It's going to be much better for you in the long run. All right, let's briefly talk about the minimum specs. I mentioned this in my other videos already, but this is pretty much going to be the same, is that for the CPU, GPU, just spend the money, upgrade the processor to the 8-core 8-GPU one, because that will just give you more headroom to work with Lightroom. So when Lightroom previews, it has 1 extra core to use. I mean, at some point when Lightroom Classic run native, Adobe will probably optimize the code to utilize those core much better. So that's always a worthwhile. It's $200. Think of it as a great investment for the machine, and especially if you're going to keep the machine in the long run. RAM, there's no question about this. If you're still asking, should I get 8 or should I get 16? The answer to that is 16, and it is unequivocally 16. There's no way for you to run all these Pro apps on 8 gigabytes of RAM, because it's going to start to do what we call swap, meaning that once the RAM is full and the programs still need more RAM, it's going to start writing to the SSD. And you don't want that to happen, because so much write to the SSD causes what they call write amplification and pretty much shorten the lifespan of the SSD. So getting more RAM is better. And that also leads me to one slight limitation for the M1 processor, as well as that you're still limited on 16 gigabytes of memory. I mean, as a pro, I definitely want more, because I don't just run Photoshop and Lightroom. I sometimes have Final Cut open at the same time, and a few Safari tabs and Chromes and mail running. When you're doing all these tasks in the real world, you'd want to have as much RAM as possible, and 16 doesn't really quite reach yet, as good as UniFi Apple memory is. SSD, go with a minimum of 512, and yes, I'm not taking my own advice here, but these are test machines. That is the reason why I've chosen to go with a smaller SSD. But here's the thing, if you're buying your own machine, go with 512, because especially when you're trying to do all these creative apps, you're going to have to put some files on the computer, or even if you're just running off like an external SSD or hard drive or something, that's perfectly fine. But here's the thing, if you start to store personal documents on there or anything like that at all, when your computer starts to get full, and if you only have 16 gigabytes of RAM, the RAM needs to write to the SSD. You want to have extra room so that the computer can also write to the SSD, rather than telling you that, hey, by the way, the computer is full, clean this up. So go with at least 512, but if you really want to ask me, the best number to get right now is at least 1, if not 2 terabyte, and that's also the max for the M1 right now is 2 terabyte memory. So some limitations there. So there you have it, my revised thought on the Apple M1 processor. I know I just recently released a video saying that the M1 is not ready for a full Pro workflow yet, and that is still true. For me, I would still use my Mac Pro for the time being, because I have a really good machine going, and if you have a 27-inch iMac, I would just recommend that you hold on to that machine for the time being, because very soon, within the next year or so, Apple is going to complete its transition to Apple Silicon, and more Pro machines is going to come with more cores, more GPU, and hopefully also more IOs on the machine. It's going to make working as a Pro a lot easier when those machine does arrive. So If you want to embrace the Apple Silicon now, you can. Like I said, Mac Mini is definitely the best one to go with. But if you want to get more RAM, for instance, if you want to get a larger SSD or a bigger screen on a portable device, because right now they're only max at 13-inch, for the time being, you just have to wait for the Pro machine to come. So again, the answer is becoming a lot more muddy now. It's not quite as clear-cut as it was before, but hopefully this guide walked you through some decisions in configuring your Apple M1 if you decide to get one. If you have any questions or comments, leave them below. Give this video a like, subscribe if you're new, hit on the bell to be notified, and until next time, in art we trust.